Hi friends, it's been a few weeks, but it's definitely time for another Meditations and Transformations and I've got a lot to cover tonight, so I'm going to jump right in. This one is simply called Natural Foresight versus Strategic Foresight. And you might be wondering, if you haven't thought about the difference between strategic foresight versus maybe transformational foresight or just futures thinking in general, what's the difference? And in particular, I want to talk tonight about foresight not only being linked to living systems, but foresight actually coming from living systems. Whereas strategic foresight is modeled specifically for the use of anticipating foresight for insights, especially in organizational or corporate settings. Because obviously, strategic foresight, the concept here is that foresight is going to be used to bolster strategy, organizational development, innovation within organizational settings, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all true. And there's actually no problem with that at all. As a matter of fact, it's super powerful. But the problem comes when we take foresight and we disconnect it from living systems, and then we only use it inside corporations. As a matter of fact, you probably have heard the term as well. If you're familiar with the field of foresight at all, you've heard the term corporate foresight. Why would such a term exist? If foresight needs to be connected to something larger than corporations. Because we know corporations have their own set of politics and their own drivers and assumptions and their own philosophy about the way the world should be run. If not, corporations wouldn't exist. Organizations might still exist, but corporations wouldn't, right? Because they are set within a certain system. They are serving that system. If they don't serve that system, they no longer would be corporations. If that system didn't exist, there would no longer be such things as corporations. You get the idea, right? So we cannot take foresight and separate it out as strategic foresight or corporate foresight. I know that many times here at TFSX, we've used the term strategic foresight because we work with companies and we're largely working on their strategy or their innovation or their organizational development. But we have always stood by and met people where they are, but not leave them where they are. Helped companies, organizations, social initiatives, whatever the case might be, to understand that foresight is larger than their strategy or their specific goals or their aims. And they are best served when they understand foresight not only being connected to living systems, but coming from living systems, so that there's something larger than strategic foresight and certainly something larger than corporate foresight, and we do ourselves a great disservice. So that's one idea. The other here is that there's something even more powerful than just foresight. That's not corporate foresight, but it's this idea of what we call natural foresight, which has existed for about 15 years now as not only a framework, as a process, but also as a practice, as you would imagine. If it's a process, as a practice, but maybe even more importantly, but equally importantly, is the idea that it exists as a philosophy. Now, I would say that all foresight has process, practice, and philosophy. We just might not realize what it is, especially the philosophy part. You might not realize when you're using foresight or utilizing foresight, or really any practice in the world, that you're doing it from a certain philosophy, right? Natural foresight says this is the philosophy that it's coming from, therefore this is also the process and the practice that will result. So in other words, we could practice corporate foresight, strategic foresight. We're probably doing it from a certain philosophy. We may not realize that. But then again, on the other hand, it doesn't even matter what the philosophy is, right? We're just looking for trends and we're trying to bolster strategy and whatever the case might be. So we never even consider what the philosophy is. Natural foresight, particularly, specifically, and pointedly, is starting from that place of a certain philosophy. What is that philosophy? It is the philosophy that foresight is connected not only to living systems, but is birthed out of living systems and therefore must serve living systems. So there's going to be this chart that you're going to see connected to this meditations and transformations. And why is natural foresight versus strategic foresight important for meditations and transformations? Because it's important to understand that we in particular would call foresight linked to living systems and coming out of living systems natural foresight. Now, others might look at it a slightly different way, and obviously that will get into the philosophy that we'll talk about in just a minute, because there are many ways to link foresight to living systems and see how it comes out of living systems, embodied, or addressing trauma, or just transformational foresight. But natural foresight is a larger ecosystem of philosophy, process, and a practice, a framework as well, that allows us to really approach foresight from that living systems perspective. So this chart, I'm going to just run through it really quickly. If strategic foresight is really addressing systems and analysis, and it's planning focused, then natural foresight is biological, psychological, and sacred, which are the dynamics of all living things. So again, corporate foresight or strategic foresight is really thinking systemically, analytically, planning focused. And that's much more narrow than looking at foresight biologically, psychologically, sacredly, much broader. It can include building strategy, but it would have done it from foresight being a biological, a psychological, and a sacred dynamic of all living things. And that'll lead to other parts of this chart where we're comparing the two further down. The second thing is if strategic foresight is dissociated and reactive. In other words, it's not linked necessarily to living systems. It's saying, how can my organization do better right now? And I'm just looking to navigate those seas and not understanding that the future is all of us, for all of us, by all of us, through all of us. So you can't just do the future of one organization. It just doesn't, that's just not the future. It's very dissociated. And in that sense also it's reactive because I'm reacting to what might manifest or the trends I'm being told, et cetera, et cetera. And you might see this in the acronym VUCA, V-U-C-A, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. That's the way that we're viewing the world through a lens of our organization where we're wanting to use foresight to make the waters calm again and to stabilize things. Oh, the world's so VUCA and uncertain, volatile, complex, ambiguous. How do I get it to be less so? And we really never can. It was always volatile, and that's not a bad thing. It's always uncertain. It's not a bad thing. But that's our reaction to a world that we don't feel like we're in control of. Whereas natural foresight says, the world was always actually alive, A-L-I-V-E, which is abductive, liminal, interconnected, vibrant, and emergent. And when we approach it from that way, then we're approaching foresight and futures thinking as something that is connected to living systems and coming out of living systems that are always abductive, liminal, interconnected, vibrant, or connected to the vibrancy or the dynamics of life itself, the vibration of life. It's not just vibrant and that it's happy with the happy colors. It's vibrational and it's emergent. I'm not explaining all of these because these are supposed to be fairly short videos. We could dive into each one of these in their own video. Maybe that even will be a point. Maybe there will be a video in each one of these. And so if strategic foresight is dissociated and reactive and it's VUCA, then natural foresight is alive, and that makes it embodied and responsive, not dissociated and reactive. Embodied and responsive from the embodiment, right? And so in that sense also, strategic foresight would be very object-oriented. Show me the trends, show me the objects, show me the event, show me the thing that I can react to, AI, or, the latest technology or the latest social change, or, changing in dynamics of populations and those things. Very object-oriented. Let me look at objects. And life itself doesn't work off of objects. It's a process. It's a very long process. And so it's much more important for us to not look at objects, but to understand the larger process, to step back and look at the larger painting of time and space and experience. And we'll get to time, space, and experience in just a minute as well. And so it's process oriented. It's a process ontology. It's a process biology. It's a process thought. And we need to be able to see what is the process that's unfolding, what is the process that is emerging, just as we talked about in Alive just a moment ago. So object-oriented and strategic foresight versus process focused or process-oriented in natural foresight. And then if strategic foresight is really mostly about epistemic uncertainty, if I just had more data, epistemic knowledge, then I would be less uncertain. Epistemic uncertainty, I don't have enough data, that makes me uncertain. Let me gather trends, let me trend hunt and trend scout and get data to analyze, systemic, planning oriented, right? Then natural foresight is ontological unpredictability, as the futurist Ilka Tuomi says. Ontological being, the nature of things, the being, the becoming, unpredictable. We're really looking at, in other ways that we're going to see in the list here, the changing nature of reality, and not trying to get more certain through more analysis and knowledge. Because again, if it's connected to life itself, then it's about the nature of the future is changing, not just that the future is unfolding, or there's, here's the future, there's the future. The nature, ontological, the nature of the future is changing. So epistemic uncertainty versus ontological unpredictability. Next on the list, I've already mentioned this. If strategic foresight is about trend scouting, show me a trend list, show me 100 trends, show me 4,000 trends, and I'll pick the ones that I think are important to my organization. Then natural foresight is really not about trends, because that's object orientation again. And I know that we love our trends, but they really don't tell us anything about the future because life itself is a process, and therefore it's about imaginal anticipation, telling different stories, understanding alternative narratives, alternative stories outside of the dominant narrative. It's not about trend scouting like strategic foresight is. Natural foresight is about imaginal anticipation, anticipating what can be, what could become, dreaming ourselves awake. It's much different. Can that actually be done? Or does that just sound like woo-woo? If it sounds like woo-woo to you, the truth of the matter is, you need more foresight more than ever before, more than you thought you did. I need foresight more than I think I do, because that should not sound woo-woo. It only sounds woo-woo because we're stuck in the strategic foresight system, our system that strategic foresight can serve and carry water for. Natural foresight helps us to break out of that system and see the future for what it really is, connected to living systems. And so then imaginal anticipation becomes the way that the universe works. It's biocosmological. It's new narratives forming. And you'll see further down the list here, it's transformational. It's not just analytical. And so in that sense, if strategic foresight is about panoptic knowledge, I'm sort of the Foucaultian jailer who can see in a circle everything that's going on. Look, strategic foresight is complex. It looks at all of this stuff that's in front of us and sees everything from a pinnacle, from a perch. But that's not really enough, because that's standing back as sort of the Foucaultian jailer and looking at everything and panoptic knowledge. I have knowledge of all of the stuff I can see in front of me. That sounds great. But natural foresight is about holoptic perception, not panoptic knowledge. Holoptic perception means that there is a big I made of many, many different voices and ways of knowing, trans-contextual, trans-rational ways of knowing across the world, ancestral, past, present, and future. One I made of many, many diverse parts that perceives what wants to emerge. Panoptic knowledge says, here is what we are trying to force to emerge, or making emerge, or creating to emerge. And holoptic perception says, here's what wants to emerge, because foresight is linked to imaginal perception of life itself, or imaginal anticipation coming from life itself and embedded and connected to life itself. See? So in that, we might also see strategic foresight is really about cohesive simplification. Just like the panoptic knowledge, if I can see all that, then I can say, I can make sense of it. Sort of back to our epistemic uncertainty again, right? And that way I can make it cohesive. I can tell a cohesive story, and I can take all of this complex knowledge and I can simplify it, and I can tell you what's going to happen, right? But natural foresight says, no, that's not how life works. Life works as coherent, not cohesive, but coherent complexity. Complexity is a beautiful thing. It is the natural order of all living things of the universe. And therefore, if we flow with it and get in a flow state with it, in a wayfinding flow state with it, as Sonia Blacknot would say, then we can enter into coherence with what wants to emerge. Coherence, complexity, aligning with, embracing complexity so that we come into coherence with it is much greater than trying to stand back and say, I'm going to make something cohesive and therefore simplify it so that we can just have this story about it and act on it and do what we want. Very different. Now this one goes all the way back up to the top again, but strategic foresight is really about results. are, as Molly Dillon would say, like input and output. And Natural Foresight says it's not about results, because if we want to try to make something happen, we're looking for results, for quick wins, right? And that's what corporate foresight, strategic foresight wants to do when it separates itself from futures as a larger trans-contextual idea. But it's like, I'm going to look at the future of work for my organization. And really, you just can't do that. Your organization is not disconnected from the rest of life. And therefore, we should be looking for futures to be something larger than our organization, right? Which is helpful to our organizations, because then we start to define what our organization means and what it can be in a much different way than we would if we make foresight serve the organization instead of the organization serving the future that wants to emerge. It's very different. So if strategic foresight is results-oriented or input and output, then natural foresight is relational. It's about relational emergence and relational thriving. When those relations of all living things, planet, cosmos, consciousness, kin, and people come into view, then we understand what wants to emerge through those relationships. The ecotone between the relationships, one person and one entity and one life plus another person, another entity, another life does not equal two. It is what emerges between the ecotonic state, the relational thriving and emergence. And so I told you earlier, time-space experience, which are slightly different things. And strategic foresight is really about time and space, because we're always talking about the year 2040 and what will it look like? Will there be trees there? Will there be cities? Time and space, time and space. We really think about the future as time and space, not yet. Then natural foresight, foresight that is connected to all of life and coming from all of life, is really about experience, which transcends time and space. It transcends the boundaries of time and space. So if we can only imagine time and space being connected to what already is and what is unfolding, as you've already heard me say, trend scouting and what's unfolding and results, and we're in this linear mechanistic spaces. And that's how we're defining foresight, that's really more forecasting. As Rilke said, the famous poet Maria Rilke, he said that the future enters into us so that we can experience, and it transforms itself in us, transforms us, and then transforms itself inside of us in an incubator, so that before it ever manifests, it's already transformed itself in us and transformed us in it. That's experience. In other words, I can have imaginal perception, other things on the list are all really connected, and experience the future and be manifesting it in myself so that it's bubbling up before time and space. So I'm not worried about futures, time and space, because that puts boundaries on it. I am worried more about future as experience, and that's transformational, and that's natural foresight, and that's how reality works. Real reality, not our systemic dominant narrative reality, the one that we're in, which is so far removed from much reality that I think it's one of the reasons we have so many problems today emotionally and mentally, is people are so far removed from reality. And we call the system that we're in reality, and it's far removed from reality. And then two more. If strategic foresight is about learning methods and tools, it's about downloading something into you. You need to have the future downloaded into you. I've got great news for you. Natural foresight is about unlocking the biological, psychological, and sacred future from within. And that's connected to our last point about experience, right? So natural foresight says, I'm unlocking the future that's already innately capable from within you. You are the future. You are the crack to the future. Rather than, I need to teach you some processes and methods, and therefore then you'll be competent or literate in futures thinking. Not downloaded as a literacy, unlocked as a capability. And then last but not least, that means that the strategic foresight is about exponential or extrapolated futures that we walk out incrementally as we learn trends and all the other things you heard in this list. If it's exponential but lived out incrementally, you've heard the phrase before, think exponential, act incrementally. That's strategic foresight. Natural foresight would instead say, think transformationally and act transitionally, based on everything that we've already heard before. And so you can see this transformational, transitional aspect is much different from living inside the system of whatever we've already got is going to be exponentialized and extrapolated, And therefore, we will incrementally learn how to walk through it so that we can benefit from it in this very small box that we would call strategic foresight or corporate foresight, that does not allow us to understand these amazing biological, psychological, and sacred features of life itself that want to emerge. So, you know what? I think this is a great place to stop. Great idea that we could potentially go over all of these again, but you're going to be able to see this chart, the difference between natural foresight as a philosophy, as a process, and then as a practice, as opposed to the limiting nature of what we would call strategic foresight, that quite honestly, this might be the most important thing I'm saying in this video, acts very differently, and I would say opposed to the way that we not only should, but must, because we are connected to life itself as well, approach futures thinking and futures consciousness so that we are connected to what wants to emerge, to life itself, and much different futures than the ones, the trajectory that we're on now, that is very unhealthy for cosmos and consciousness and planet and kin and people. And I'll see you on the next Meditations and Transformations. Bye-bye.